Blueprint for Life. We believe each of us has a unique blueprint crafted by God Himself. This podcast will explore how to discover and unlock that blueprint, allowing you to live a life of purpose, fulfillment, and joy. Through insightful conversations, thought-provoking interviews, and biblical truths, we will delve into the keys that can unlock your potential. Together, we will navigate the challenges, setbacks, and triumphs that come our way, always relying on the timeless wisdom found in God's Word. Now, let's get started with this episode of Blueprint for Life. Here's Elder McCarter.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blueprint for Life, where I believe that God has a unique plan for us that has been set aside from the very foundation of the world, set aside by God Himself to give us a blessed ending, not the kind of thing that we may have been used to, not the kind of life that we may have grown accustomed to, but the kind of life that He has already set aside and made plans for. I am your host, Lawrence McCarter, and this is another episode. We're going to be talking about salvation by election. Salvation by election. And I know that some people may think, oh, this sounds like one of those really heavy theological topics. Yes, it can sometimes be a very heavy theological topic, but I am going to do my absolute best to, for lack of a better way of saying it, dumb it down a little bit, because quite frankly, I think that unfortunately, too often we have these difficult topics that we need to deal with, but unfortunately we don't. And as a result, there are so many things that both Christian and non-Christian wrestle with and don't fully understand. And as a result, we shy away from these things. We shy away from conversations that we should be having so that we can better understand how we ought to interact with the God of the universe, the very one who has this epic plan for our lives, the one who has this plan, who desires for us to be genuinely happy. And because we shy away from these conversations, we don't know how it fits. We don't know how we fit. But I think if we take the time to have these conversations and we take the time to simplify these concepts that can seem to be a bit highbrow or out of reach, and we simplify those things down, maybe, just maybe, we can actually take the time to understand those things and really get a chance to see how they interact with the plan that God has for our lives. And we can genuinely see how He wants us to be happy and how He wants us to live a satisfied and fulfilled life. And it doesn't always have to be all about the struggle and the stress and the pain and the aggravation that seems to be such a normal thing for our lives. Yeah, I do want to talk about salvation by election. And since we're already in the middle of election season and everything has gone crazy, the news has been all over the place. We've had a truly unfortunate assassination attempt on former President Trump, and I don't care where you stand on, the political spectrum, whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, or independent, or what have you. I don't think it is a good idea to try to assassinate a political leader. That's just my opinion. Everybody's entitled to their own, but realistically, I don't think it's a good idea. I'm of the opinion that we ought to let God take care of these things. We ought to, sure, we can have our position, we can have our opinion, and that is what elections are for. But ultimately, trust that God has this whole thing in control, and going out of our way to try to quote unquote rub somebody out, it's not really going to accomplish anything. The poor guy that took that upon himself, now he's gone. And now he's going to have to stand in judgment for the decisions that he's made over the course of his life. And I can only pray for him and for his family and for everyone involved, even those who were innocent bystanders and whose lives were affected by all of this. I just pray that this country somehow manages not to tear itself apart throughout this entire process, and that we somehow manage to hold on just a little while longer as this world continues to hurtle toward the end that has already been written about and spoken of in the text. But I guess that's neither here nor there. But my prayers to everyone involved, my prayers to and for everyone who has been affected by this, and I pray that cooler heads prevail and that peace might reign in this situation, and that ultimately God gets glory in all of this. But with all that said, and all of my prayers going up for everyone involved, salvation by election. Now, first of all words have meaning, and context is king. So I want to approach this from a standpoint of as if I'm talking to somebody who has absolutely no clue what it is I'm talking about. All right. So I'm going to pretend for just a moment as if I am talking to somebody who has no idea. Now, you might not be that person, but the person next to you just might be. So bear with me for just a moment. All right. So first of all, let's define election as it pertains to the biblical context. Okay. Election under the biblical context is the sovereign act of God of choosing certain individuals to salvation before the foundation of the world. All right. So essentially what that's basically saying is we are looking at the idea or the concept that God has already chosen those who are going to go to heaven. Now, I don't want you to get too twisted up and tied up in the whole idea that God has already chosen, because some people have used this idea to have kind of a pessimistic outlook, so to speak, when it comes down to salvation. Because the idea is, if God's already chosen, what if he didn't choose me? Does it matter? Does it really matter what I do? And just to give you an idea of where we're coming from, there's really two major views when it comes down to election within the Christian faith. One is the foreknowledge view, and that's essentially that God's election is based on his foreknowledge. And that view says that God used his foreknowledge to look down the corridors of time. He peeked all the way down from the beginning of time to the very end of time, and was able to see who would respond favorably to his gospel message. And that based on that, he elected certain persons to salvation. Now, I guess from a certain standpoint, that could be considered a viable option. Okay, we're looking at the idea that because of God's knowledge, the fact that he is omniscient and omnipresent, because he has all knowledge and he's all powerful, and that he's able to see the entire timeline from the very beginning to the very end, because he is Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, because he has knowledge of everything that has happened, will happen, could happen, that he knows exactly who will and will not accept salvation. So as a result, he already decided who would be saved. So in that regard, some people might say it doesn't really matter what I do, because God has already decided if I will or will not be saved. And then there's the idea of sovereignty. Okay. The idea is that it's based on God's sovereign choice. Let's just say that because God is sovereign, he has already decided on who's going to be saved. It's based on God's sovereignty. First of all, there's several parts to this. That one, since salvation is a gift from God, and you have to remember that salvation truly is a gift from God, and this is something that was completely one-sided. It's something that we didn't earn. Okay, you have to remember that. Salvation is something that man did not earn, could not earn. We were not ever in a position to earn salvation. There's never a point in time where man could have earned salvation. The cost was way too high. The cost was life. A life had to be given. Blood had to be shed. And you can't purchase something that costs your life and then acquire it. Okay? If you are incapable of purchasing it because the cost is too high, then it would require that God provide it. So thereby, it's necessitated that it be offered by God according to his sovereignty. But see, then here comes the question of, is this not limited? Because if election is limited, if it's limited by the fact that either God already knows who's going to be saved, so he's already picked out the people who are going to be saved, so what's the point trying to be saved, or what's the point of putting forth the effort of being saved, then that creates a limitation on pursuing salvation. But if that's the case, why does anybody bother being saved? And then on the other hand, there's the question of, what does God do with someone who would be considered a reprobate? Because the Bible does speak of those who are reprobates. And when I speak of reprobates, I'm talking about those who have received salvation and then they turn their back on God completely, walk away from him completely. Those are considered reprobates. What does God do with a reprobate? Someone who, having come to the full knowledge of God and then turn completely away from him, was that person elect or not? So there's a lot of different issues that rise with these questions of where do you stand on being elect. But again, that is the definition that we're working with on elect. That's where we're starting at. All right. That's where we're working. Election is the sovereign act of God of choosing certain individuals to salvation before the foundation of the world. Now, let's jump in. Salvation by election. You can see indications of this from the very, very beginning. All right. Let's look at Genesis, the 3rd chapter, Adam's fall. And again, I'm not going to read every scripture that comes through here, but I would recommend that you take note of them and read them for yourself. I encourage it. But if you look at the 3rd chapter of Genesis, the fall of Adam, Adam sinned. That's pretty well understood. Adam sinned. He was in the garden with Eve, and he ate of the fruit. He disobeyed God, and as a result, he was cast out of the garden. This is when man fell away from God. He fell into sin. He lost his favored status. And then you see in the 12th chapter of Genesis that God initiated his plan of redemption, at least on earth. The evidence of it was seen on earth. Now, because God is all-knowing, He's omniscient. This plan was already in place because God was already aware that Adam wasn't going to make the cut. He already knew. So the plan was already in place because God was aware that Adam wasn't going to do what he was supposed to do. He already had in place the means to prepare, or the means to fix what had been broken. Why can I say that? Because if you look at the 3rd chapter and you look shortly after Adam and Eve sinned, when God came to Adam and Eve and found them in their fallen state, and Adam reported to God. When God came into the garden and asked, "Where are you?" as if he didn't already know. And Adam reported or responded to God, "Hey, I heard you were in the garden and I was afraid because we were naked." And God is like, "Who told you were naked? Who told you were naked? Did you eat from the tree that I told you not to eat from?" And again, God is not asking these questions because he doesn't know the answer to them. He's asking these questions because Adam is being given an opportunity to respond. It's a conversation. And this is where, and I hate to say it like this, but this is where the beginning of the idea of passing the buck comes in at, because God asks Adam a question and he shoves the blame onto Eve. And then God asks Eve a question and she shoves the blame onto the serpent. And we've been shoving the blame onto somebody else ever since. But that's neither here nor there. Let's keep going. Anyway, after God pronounced his judgment on Adam and Eve, the Bible then says that God took skins and clothed Adam and Eve. But he never says where he got the skins from. But I guarantee you that there wasn't an animal walking around named Skin that he just happened to just grab and wrap around Adam and Eve. Something had to die in order to provide the covering necessary to cover what was essentially their sin, the evidence of their sin. Something had to die. Blood had to be shed. So here we find the first indicator of the sacrifice necessary to cover the sins of man. The first indicator of God's plan to redeem man back to himself. The first indicator of the payment required to redeem man back to himself. Blood had to be shed. So then we look to the 12th chapter in Genesis. We see how God begins to initiate his plan of redemption on earth. God chooses a man by the name of Abram, whom he would later change his name to Abraham. But anyway, Abram was born in Ur of the Chaldeans, but he moved away with his father, his wife, and his nephew to a city called Haran in northern Mesopotamia. And after his father's death, at the age of 75, Abram, by the way, the Bible doesn't say exactly, no, the Bible does say his father was 200 and some odd, but Abram was 75 years old when God came to him and told him to leave Haran and all of his relatives and go, and I quote, "to the land which I will show you." Now, all of this is important. Why? Why would any of this be important? Why is it important that God calls this guy Abram and says that he was born in Ur and that he lived with his father and he had a wife and a nephew named Lot and that they moved to Haran? And why is any of that important? It's not.
Hey there, fellow listeners. As we wind down another inspiring episode of Blueprint for Life, we want to thank you for tuning in. Remember, you can always find more uplifting content and past episodes on our website, blueprintforlifepodcast.com, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Join us next week as Elder McCarter continues this impactful message, giving more insight into God's plan for your personal blueprint. Until then, stay blessed and keep shining your light.